The first thing he heard was fire. Not the roar of it, the fire was too spread out for that, too distributed across too many blocks to produce a single coherent sound. It was the collection of fire, the specific acoustic texture of a city burning at its edges, the low, continuous exhale of structures that had been broken open and left to smolder. Beneath that, the groan of compromised concrete deciding whether to hold. Beneath that, wind moving through spaces that had not been open to wind before yesterday. Then, silence. The particular silence of a place where the people who would normally fill it with noise were either gone or too hurt to make any. Mark Grayson's eyes opened. He was on his back in the rubble of what used to be downtown. The sky above him was the specific gray of a city whose fires were blocking the morning sun. Not dark, not light, but filtered. The color of something seen through a layer of things that had burned. His suit was shredded from the collar down the left side, the material split along a line that corresponded to an impact he could feel as a deep structural ache in his ribcage. The kind of ache that meant the bones had flexed past their tolerance and were deciding how seriously to report it. He had woken up in rubble before. 43 times, on 43 different worlds, over 900 years. He knew the first assessment by reflex. Breathing functional, spine intact, extremities responsive. He ran it before he was fully conscious of running it. The memories arrived while he was still doing this. Not a flood, not a rush. They settled the way sediment settles in water that has been disturbed, slowly, by weight, layer by layer, until the full depth was visible. 900 years of it. The weight of every campaign, every throne room, every morning he had stood at a window on Viltrum and looked at a star field that still had enemies in it. The weight of a crown, the weight of her hand in his, 900 years of that specific weight, the last thing he remembered before the reboot took everything and sent him here. He did not gasp. He did not reach for anything or thrash against the settling of it. He breathed, slowly, deliberately, through the sensation of being two people occupying one skull. And he let the memories find their positions, and when they were done, he was still lying in the rubble of downtown with a cracked ribcage and the mind of a 900-year-old emperor looking up at a smoke-filtered sky. He looked at his hands. Young, the knuckles were wrong, too smooth, without the specific layering of scar tissue that centuries of Viltrumite-level impact eventually produced even on skin that healed fast. The hands of a boy who had been fighting for at most a year. He turned them over, made a fist. The strength was there, enormous and raw and slightly too large for the container of it. A river that had not yet found its banks. One more time, he said to the rubble, to the smoke-colored sky. Not a question, not a declaration. The specific tone of a man giving himself an order he will not debate, because debating it would be a waste of time he does not have. He sat up. He rolled his neck. He got to his feet. He did not help immediately, though he could have. He found the tallest structurally intact surface within flight range, the remains of a building that had lost its upper floors but kept its base. The kind of ruin that looked almost deliberate, like someone had cut the top off cleanly. And he stood on it, and he looked at the city the way he had looked at the opening positions of 1,000 campaigns. He catalogued. The destruction was concentrated in predictable corridors, the paths the alternates had taken, the zones where multiple of them had intersected, the places where the infrastructure had been load-bearing for too many other things and had failed in cascades when the primary structure went. He filed this. He had seen worse. He had governed worlds that looked worse than this on their best days after the Empire was done with them. He knew the difference between destruction that healed and destruction that didn't. This healed. Expensive, slow, but it healed. 2 miles southwest, he recognized the GA's operational signature in the movement pattern of the emergency response units. The specific overlapping coverage approach with deliberate blind spots. the channeling of civilian movement toward pre-designated collection zones. Cecil's doctrine, unchanged in 900 years, because Cecil Stedman's institutional culture had outlasted him with the specific stubbornness of a very good system built by a very paranoid man. In the northern sky, his father was working. He could see Nolan's trajectory from here, the wide, careful arcs of someone doing physical rescue work, moving debris, lifting the things that machinery couldn't. The movement pattern had guilt in it. Not literally, not visibly to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But Mark had spent 900 years learning to read the movement of Viltrumites the way other people read faces. And the specific quality of Nolan's arcs, the overcorrection, the extra attention to each task, the way he stayed close to the work instead of surveying from above, was the movement of a man performing penance in the only language his body understood. Mark looked at the space where Anissa was not. She was not here yet. She was 6 days away, aboard whatever ship she had taken, moving through the specific dark between Viltrum and Earth at the best speed available to her. He did not know the ship. He did not know the route. He knew she was coming, because 900 years of marriage had built in him a bedrock certainty about this woman that operated below the level of thought, and the certainty said, she is alive, she remembers, she is coming. He ran the other calculation while he was up here, the one that mattered as much as anything else. Conquest's deployment authorization would have cleared through Viltrumite command channels before the Invincible War concluded. That was how the Empire operated. Parallel tracks, no waiting for one situation to close before the next opened. Because waiting was inefficiency, and Thragg did not tolerate inefficiency. Based on the class of vessel the Empire assigned to punitive assessment missions, based on the transit distance from the nearest staging point to Earth's solar system, based on Conquest's known tendency to travel at exactly the pace the mission required, and no faster. Because urgency implied that the destination was a threat, and Conquest did not acknowledge threats, 8 days. 7. If his memory of the logistics was slightly off. Either way, more than enough. He had done more with less time than this on worlds that weren't even partially prepared. He watched the city work on itself from the top of the ruined building, and he planned. And by the time he dropped from the structure and went to do the work the moment required of him, the broad architecture of the next 10 days was already assembled in his mind, with the specific solidity of things that had been thought through properly. On Viltrum, the light was a different color entirely. It came through the narrow window of the military barracks in flat bars of blue-white. Viltrum's atmosphere stripped it of the warm scatter that Earth's thicker air would have provided, and what reached the interior of the room was cold and precise and entirely indifferent to what it was illuminating. The barracks were built for function. Every surface in the room communicated this. The bed, the wall, the floor, a civilization that had never developed the concept that a space should feel like something had built this room, and the room felt like exactly what it was, a place for soldiers to store themselves between uses. Anissa sat on the edge of the bed, with her hands between her knees. She looked at her hands the way Mark had looked at his, with the specific attention of someone checking the inventory of a body they were not accustomed to inhabiting. Younger, the hands were younger, and the strength in them was enormous and poorly contained, and she had the specific sensation of wearing something that did not quite fit in the way of clothes that were almost the right size. The 900 years of discipline that had refined her control down to something almost invisible, the 900 years that had made her capable of choosing exactly how much force to apply to exactly which surface, and having the result be exactly what she had intended. None of that discipline was in this body's muscle memory yet. It would come back. She knew that. She had done this once, a long time ago, building it from nothing. She could do it faster now, knowing what she was building toward. She breathed. Once, slow then, she said his name, quietly, to herself. In the dialect that did not exist yet, the language they had built together across decades of private communication, Viltrumite grammatical architecture carrying English words that Mark had never fully shed because he was fundamentally, incurably from Earth, and no amount of empire had changed that. She had loved him for it. Still did. Nobody on Viltrum spoke this dialect. It would not exist for years. The sound of it in her own voice, in this room, on this morning, confirmed everything the settled weight of her memories had already told her. She stood up. She did not stand at the window. She did not give herself the moment of processing that a lesser person might have taken, the adjustment period, the orientation, the careful deliberation about what to do next. She had made every decision she needed to make approximately 900 years ago in a different life, and arriving in a younger body in a less convenient location did not add any new variables to the equation. She got dressed. She walked out of the barracks. A junior officer was at the corridor intersection. He looked up from his post with the automatic attention of someone who has a procedural question to ask. He opened his mouth. She did not stop walking. The officer watched her continue down the corridor. He processed the quality of her movement, the complete, unhurried authority of someone who expects not to be questioned, an expectation so total it generated its own gravity field. And he made the practical calculation that his procedural question could wait for someone more senior to resolve. He went back to what he was doing. The fleet dock was 4 levels below the barracks complex. She took the most direct route. At the first checkpoint, the guard reviewed her identification with the professional attention of someone who would escalate if he found a reason to. He found no reason to. At the second checkpoint, the guard was monitoring a different section of the dock and did not register her passage at all. She found the ship. Not the largest, she had no use for large. Not the most impressive. Impressive was a statement, and she was not here to make statements. Not yet. She found the fastest ship in the current manifest. A scout-class courier logged for a diplomatic run in 18 hours that it was not going to make, and she boarded it with the ease of someone who had been boarding Viltrumite vessels for the better part of a millennium. The systems came up under her hands. The interface had not changed substantially in 900 years. She had opinions about this. She launched. The dock's monitoring system had approximately 90 seconds to flag the unauthorized departure before she was beyond the range where flagging it would accomplish anything. She was in the upper atmosphere in 40 of them. In open space, she set the navigation. The calculation resolved. She looked at the result. 6 days, on this trajectory, at this ship's maximum speed. And she leaned back in the pilot's seat and looked at the star field through the forward viewport. She had not allowed herself the moment until now. Not while she was in the barracks, not while she was moving through the checkpoints, not while she was calculating the trajectory. There had been nothing to allow. Each of those things required her full attention, and she had given it. Now the ship was set, and the course was locked, and there was nothing for the next 6 days except the dark between here and him. She let herself think about the last thing she remembered before the reboot. His hand in hers. The specific weight of it, 9 centuries of weight carried in the simple fact of his fingers over hers. The particular way he held on that had not changed substantially since approximately year 40, when he had finally stopped being surprised that she stayed. The certainty that had been the bedrock of her entire adult life. The last second of it, which had been enough, which had always been enough, because 900 years with the right person produced the specific knowledge that enough was what you called it when it was complete. She closed her eyes. "Hold the line, husband," she said to the viewport, to the dark, to the star she knew was his sun from this angle of approach. "I am 6 days away." The Gita's deep space tracking array flagged the incoming warp signature at 0347 hours, and by 0349 Cecil Stedman was standing in front of the display with his reading glasses on and his second cup of coffee untouched beside him. The trajectory plot took 90 seconds to resolve. Single vessel. Viltrumite drive signature. The harmonic frequency of it was distinct enough that the array's recognition software flagged it in the first pass. No ambiguity, no margin for alternate interpretation. Coming in on a direct intercept course with Earth's surface. Making no attempt at concealment. No course variation, no deceptive approach geometry. It was not hiding. Whatever this was, it had decided that hiding was unnecessary. Cecil set down his glasses. "Get Omni-Man," he said to the room. "Get Invincible. Stage everything functional at the projected landing site." He looked at the trajectory's surface destination, open ground, eastern perimeter, 3 miles outside the city limits. Not deployed. Staged. There's a difference. His aides started making calls. Cecil kept looking at the display and did what Cecil always did when a situation exceeded his current models. He built a new one. A single ship was not an assault force. A single ship that wasn't hiding was either very confident or very deliberate, and in his experience those two conditions tended to arrive together. He had no model for what came next. He built one anyway, because the alternative was standing in front of a screen with nothing in his hands, and Cecil Stedman had not survived 30 years of this job by standing anywhere with nothing in his hands. Mark received the notification on a GDA issue communicator that he had accepted without comment 4 days ago. He read the message. He already knew what it was. He had been tracking the approach window since yesterday, running the transit calculation against his memory of Anissa's options at the Viltrumite dock, arriving at 6 days as the most likely figure and finding the figure confirmed. He said he would be there. He flew toward the projected landing site. Nolan fell in beside him 2 miles out, coming down from the northern sector where he had been working through the night. For a moment they flew in parallel without speaking, the city moving beneath them in the specific patchwork of its recovery. The lit zones and the dark zones, the machinery running in the sectors that had been cleared enough to work in. "Do you know what this is?" Nolan asked. "Yes," Mark said. "Are you going to tell me? When we land." Nolan looked at his son. He had been looking at his son with increasing frequency over the past 6 days, the way you look at a familiar object that has been moved slightly. Everything in the right place, nothing quite aligned correctly. Mark had not been afraid since the morning after the Invincible War. Not once. Not of anything. And Nolan had spent 2,000 years among Viltrumites. Had spent 2,000 years learning the specific taxonomy of their stillness. And the stillness inside his teenage son was not the stillness of someone who had processed trauma and come out the other side. It was the stillness of someone who already knew how this ended. He flew in silence beside his son and did not push it, because something in him had begun to understand that pushing would not produce information. It would produce, instead, a demonstration of how much he did not understand, and he was not ready for that demonstration yet. Cecil's assembled force was in position when they arrived, 12 functional heroes in various states of combat readiness. 2 JETA tactical teams with equipment that would have been impressive 3 weeks ago and was now, in the context of what the Invincible War had demonstrated about the scale of threats Earth actually faced. Somewhat less so. Cecil himself was in a field command configuration at the perimeter's edge, a position he occupied with the specific authority of a man who had stopped needing to perform authority many years ago. He looked at Mark when Mark landed. He had been looking at Mark this way for 6 days, the look of a man whose professional taxonomy did not have a category for what he was seeing and who was building one in real time. Mark looked at the trajectory projection on Cecil's field display, confirmed the landing site, and moved to a position 12 feet forward of the assembled line. Nobody asked him to move there. Nobody moved to stop him. The ship came through the atmosphere on a controlled descent angle that left a thermal signature across the lower cloud layer, a bright line that faded from white to orange to nothing as the vessel decelerated through the approach. It did not crash. It carved a trench 40 meters long into the prepared ground east of the perimeter and came to rest with the specific. aggressive precision of a landing that was making a statement about how seriously the pilot took the concept of a gentle touchdown. The dust bloomed. The heroes on the line raised arms against it. The dust settled. The hatch opened. Anissa stepped out into the morning light of a planet she had crossed 900 years of dark to reach. And she was wearing Viltrumite officer's attire. Not combat armor, not the military dress of a soldier preparing for engagement, but the high-ranking formal uniform of someone who had spent centuries walking into rooms and requiring them to reorganize themselves around her presence. She was not armed with anything external. She scanned the assembled line with the calm, professional efficiency of someone taking attendance at a meeting she had called. And then she looked past all of them. She found Mark. The professional composure did not break. It did not crack or crumble or fall away. It simply became, for one unguarded moment, insufficient for what was behind it, something vast and warm and entirely private. An expression that existed in the language of 9 centuries of shared life and was meant for exactly one person in the assembled group. Mark moved through the line. He did not ask anyone to move. He did not announce his intention. He walked with the quiet directional certainty of someone who has already decided where they are going, and finds the concept of obstacles theoretical, and the people in front of him stepped aside the way people step aside for things that have already committed to their direction, without quite deciding to do it. He stopped 10 feet from her. They looked at each other. The assembled heroes were in the posture of people braced for violence, weight distributed, hands available. The collective physical readiness of a group that had been doing this for years and knew what the moment before something terrible felt like. The moment before something terrible did not arrive. What arrived instead was an absence of beginning. 2 people for whom this was not a meeting but a continuation, regarding each other across 10 feet of churned earth, with the complete stillness of those who have nothing left to establish. Then he closed the distance, and her arms came up, and they held each other. It was not dramatic. There was nothing in it that performed relief, because relief implied that the alternative had been real, and neither of them had allowed the alternative to be real. It was the specific quality of an embrace that has been repeated 10,000 times, and has long since stopped requiring any adjustment, the geometry of 2 people who fit, simply, completely. The way things fit when they have been shaped by the same long pressure. He said something in her ear. The words were not loud enough to reach anyone else. The language they were in was not a language anyone present spoke, a dialect built from Viltrumite grammatical architecture and English words that Mark had never fully shed. A private system developed over decades of communication that needed to be private. Whatever he said, it was brief. She answered in the same dialect, in the same quiet register. And whatever her answer was, it produced from her a single exhale of laughter, not performed, not the social signal of laughter, but the involuntary sound of something very heavy being set down after a very long carry. The sound of someone who has been holding a thing for 6 days and 900 years simultaneously, and has finally been given permission to stop. 3 people watched this and understood nothing and everything simultaneously. Nolan stood very still at the perimeter's edge. He had spent 2,000 years learning the body language of Viltrumites, and what he was looking at was 2 Viltrumites who had the specific physical ease of people who had been each other's most familiar environment for so long that proximity had become the default state and distance the aberration. He was reassessing everything he thought he had understood about his son's state of mind over the past 6 days, and the reassessment was producing results that did not fit any framework he currently possessed. Cecil was running calculations. The calculations were not landing on satisfying answers. A Viltrumite ship had arrived at Earth 8 days after the most devastating attack the planet had ever experienced, and instead of a threat or a demand or any of the 17 scenarios his models had generated, what he was looking at was Invincible embracing the pilot. Cecil's models did not contain this outcome. He was already building new models, and the new models were deeply unsettling, and he was going to need significantly more information before any of them were useful. Eve stood at the far edge of the assembly, outside the perimeter, where she had positioned herself because she had arrived late, and because some instinct had told her to stay at the edge of whatever this was, rather than the center of it. She had known Mark Grayson. She had been in the process of knowing him, of building toward knowing him, of understanding the specific shape of who he was. And over the past 6 days, that understanding had been developing a fault line that she hadn't been able to locate until this moment. The man who had just walked through 12 assembled heroes to reach a Viltrumite pilot was not the Mark Grayson she had been building toward knowing. She could not have said what was different. The face was the same. The voice, in the brief exchanges she had witnessed, was the same register. But something behind the face was operating from a set of experiences she did not have access to, and the woman he was holding had access to all of them, and Eve understood, with the quiet devastation of a thing understood rather than felt, that she was looking at a relationship she had not known existed until 30 seconds ago, and that it was 900 years older than anything she had. She unclenched her jaw. She turned away. She walked in the direction away from the landing site, and she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that was going to resolve into something easier to look at. Mark and Anissa separated with the natural economy of people who have somewhere to be. Not dramatically, the declutch of two people who have finished one thing and are moving to the next. He turned to face the assembled group. She took her position at his side, not behind him, not slightly ahead, exactly level, the geometry of it as automatic as breathing. Cecil demanded an explanation, in the specific flatness of a man who frames demands as requests, because he has learned that the framing produces better results. "She's not a threat," Mark said. "She's with me. Conquest arrives in 2 days. That's where our attention needs to be." "Who is she?" Cecil said. "Why is she here? How do you know her?" Mark looked at Cecil with an expression that Cecil would spend the next several days trying to classify. It was patient. Completely, genuinely patient. Not the patience of someone suppressing frustration, but the patience of someone operating from a great enough height that the question being asked appeared. From that height, considerably smaller than the person asking it believed it to be. Cecil had dealt with superheroes for 3 decades. He had been managed and manipulated and outthought by people with capabilities far beyond his own. He had never experienced the specific sensation of a teenager, making him feel like his questions were taking up space that more important things needed. He did not push further. Nolan tried the gentler approach, the father's approach, drawing Mark aside from the group with the quiet request of someone who knows he is operating on uncertain ground and is choosing his footing carefully. He asked his son, simply, what had happened to him. Mark looked at his father. The thing behind his eyes moved, not surfaces. Not the performed emotion of a teenager responding to a parent's concern, but something that had traveled a very long distance to be here and was still, even now, in the process of arriving. "I grew up, Dad," he said. The tone of it stopped Nolan completely. Not because it was unkind, it was not unkind. Because it was true in a register that had nothing to do with age. And the truth in it was 900 years deep, and Nolan heard the depth of it even without any framework for understanding what he was hearing. He stood with that, and Mark moved on. Because there was work to do. They worked for the next 4 hours on the preparation for Conquest's arrival. Mark directed the relocation of critical civilian infrastructure away from the likely engagement zones. He worked from a mental map of the city's structural vulnerabilities that was more detailed than anything the GDA had on file. And the GDA observers watching him work quietly added this to the list of things about Invincible that did not currently have an explanation. Anissa moved through the work without instruction. Mark would identify a problem in broad terms. A structural issue 3 blocks north. a civilian corridor that needed clearing before tomorrow morning. Before he finished speaking, she was already moving to address a specific component of the problem he had not named, filling in the gap between what he had said and what he had meant with the ease of someone who had been reading the space between his words for 9 centuries. She found 2 vulnerabilities he hadn't mentioned and suggested alternative approaches to both. He incorporated them without discussion, because they were right and he knew they were right, and neither of them paused to acknowledge the exchange because acknowledging it would have implied it required acknowledgement. The G'da observers watched this and could not articulate what was wrong with it. Eve did not watch it. Eve was already 3 blocks away, sitting on a piece of cleared rubble in the specific attitude of someone who is processing something they did not ask to process, looking at the middle distance, finding nothing there that helped. The city below them was working on itself. From the rooftop they had chosen, 12 stories up, the building intact enough to hold them and isolated enough to hold no one else, the recovery effort was visible in its full complexity. The sectors with power and the sectors without. The machinery running in the zones that had been cleared enough to work in, the specific amber of emergency lighting in the zones that hadn't. 3 days since Anissa had landed, 6 since Mark had woken up in the rubble. The triage was not finished. It would not be finished for months. Neither of them was looking at the city. Anissa had her head on Mark's shoulder. It happened with the ease of something done 10,000 times. Not a decision, not a gesture. Simply the body finding a position it had occupied for so long that it remembered the way home without being told. His arm came around her with the same ease, the same quality of automatic return, and for a moment they were simply 2 people on a rooftop above a city that was healing, and the 900 years between the last time they had done this and now collapsed into nothing at all. She said, "Your body feels different." "Younger," he said. Louder, she shifted slightly, finding the position she wanted. All the strength without the architecture. Everything registers at full volume. "I broke a door handle this morning reaching for it. I put my fist through a wall on day 1, he said, reaching for a railing." She looked up at him. "You didn't tell me that. It was embarrassing." "It absolutely was," she agreed, and the warmth in it. The specific warmth of 2 people who have been finding each other's embarrassments endearing for 9 centuries was the first purely uncomplicated thing either of them had felt since waking up. He said, "It'll come back faster this time. We know what we're building toward." 3 years, the first time. For me. 2.5, he corrected. 3, she said. "You were being generous when you said 2.5. You always were with the training assessments." He didn't argue. She was right. He had always been slightly generous with her training assessments in the early years, not because she needed the encouragement, but because watching her exceed the generous assessment by the end of each cycle had been one of his more reliable private pleasures. He had told her this approximately 200 years in. She had filed it away and used it against him in arguments for the next 700. The city below them continued its work. A crane somewhere to the northwest moved through its rotation, the mechanical sound of it reaching them on the wind that came off the damaged skyline. "What do you miss?" she asked. He thought about it. Not performing the consideration, actually running the inventory, which was a longer list than either of them would admit to anyone else. "The library," he said. "Specifically the East Wing. The section you organized by species origin and I kept reorganizing by subject matter, and we never resolved it. It was better by species origin. It was better by subject matter. It was objectively better by species origin, and you know it. It was subjectively better by species origin, and I tolerated it for 4 centuries because I love you," he said. She smiled, the private version, the one that belonged entirely to him and had no public use. "What else?" "The cook. The one we had for 60 years. The one who spent the whole 60 years trying to make my mother's enchiladas and never quite got there." He got close in year 47. He got close in year 47, Mark agreed. What do you miss? She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the crane completed its rotation and began another. The quiet, she said. The specific quiet of a morning on Viltrum after we'd finished something. When the administrative work hadn't started yet, and the military situation was managed, and there was nothing that needed us for a few hours. A pause. We didn't have enough of those mornings. We'll have more of them this time, he said. Yes, she said. We will. He found Nolan at 0430 in the northern sector, setting down the last beam from a collapse that had been blocking a residential access route since the war. His father straightened as Mark landed, and the expression on his face, the specific combination of relief and wariness that Nolan had been wearing whenever Mark appeared over the past 6 days, settled into something more careful. Walk with me, Mark said. They walked. Through the cleared corridor, past the emergency lighting, into the specific quiet of a section of the city that had been addressed and was now waiting for the next stage of its recovery. When Mark spoke, he spoke without preamble, because he had learned in 900 years of governance that preamble was for people who were not sure what they were about to say. You need to know some things, Mark said. Not everything. Enough? Nolan walked beside him and listened. Mark told him the broad architecture, the temporal displacement, not the reboot's mechanics, which were genuinely difficult to explain and ultimately irrelevant to the operational picture, but the fact of it. He and Anissa had come back from a future that did not need to happen the way it had happened the first time. They had experience that the current moment did not reflect. He knew what Conquest was capable of. He knew what the Empire was planning. He knew, with the specific precision of someone who had already navigated every step of the next decade, what Earth needed in order to survive it. Nolan walked. He processed. He was 2,000 years old, and the range of things he was capable of processing was considerable, but Mark could see the specific effort of this one. The effort of a man recalibrating not just information, but the fundamental structure of a relationship he thought he understood. How old are you? Nolan asked. Not his body's age. The other one. 900 and something, Mark said. I stopped counting around year 600. Anissa says that's very on brand for me. Nolan was quiet for a moment. Then, you've surpassed me. In the ways that matter, Mark said. Not cruelly, simply accurately. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man processing an inversion he had not anticipated. Nolan had spent 2,000 years being the one with experience to give, the one who knew more, had seen more, had survived more. The adjustment required by the fact that his teenage son had, in some fundamental sense, surpassed him without his knowledge was not a small adjustment. Mark let him have it. He did not fill the silence. He had learned around year 300 that some adjustments needed their full space, and that rushing them produced a result that looked like acceptance and wasn't. What do you need from me? Nolan asked. Stay on Earth, Mark said. When Anissa and I leave for Viltrum, and we will leave, after Conquest, Earth needs its strongest defender here. The Gita is functional but limited. You're the only Viltrumite-level asset they have if something moves while we're gone. Nolan nodded. And if something moves that I can't handle alone, then you handle as much of it as you can, and trust that we'll be back before it matters. Mark looked at his father. I know that's not a satisfying answer. No, Nolan said, but it's an honest one. He paused. Are you asking me or telling me? Mark considered this. I'm asking, he said. I'd like to leave knowing you're here. The telling is available, but I'd rather not use it. Something in Nolan's face moved, not quite relief, something more complicated than relief. The specific emotion of a father who has been offered respect by a person who no longer needs to offer it. I'll be here, he said. Mark nodded. He started to move. Mark, Nolan said. He turned. Nolan looked at his son, the teenage face, the ancient interior, and said, "I'm proud of you." Then, because he was Nolan and honesty was the one currency he had learned to trust, "I don't fully know what I'm proud of yet, but I am." Mark looked at his father for a moment. 900 years of a complicated relationship with this man, the love and the betrayal and the forgiveness, and the specific long work of understanding that his father was doing his best, had always been doing his best, with the tools available to him. All of it moved through him without settling on his face. "I know, Dad," he said. He went. Anissa found Cecile in his field command post, which was the kind of space that communicated everything about the man who had built it, functional to the point of austerity, information-dense, positioned with sightlines in 3 directions. Cecil was reviewing a display when she came in. He did not look up immediately, which was its own kind of statement. When he did look up, he said, "Close the door." She closed it. He set down what he was reviewing, folded his hands, and looked at her with the specific expression of a man about to play the only cards he has left. "I know who you are," he said. "I have files on every Viltrumite who's appeared in Empire deployment records or entered Earth's operational sphere in the past 30 years. Yours is thinner than Omni-Man's, but it exists. You left Viltrum without authorization. You commandeered Imperial property." He paused, for effect, in the specific way of a man who has learned that pauses do more work than words. "Thragg will not consider those minor infractions." Anissa sat down in the chair across from him, which he had not offered. She sat the way she sat in everything, completely, without hedging, as if the chair had been waiting for her rather than the other way around. She let him finish. He did not have more to say after the pause, so she spoke. "Cecil," she said, "I have navigated Viltrumite imperial politics for longer than your civilization has had written language. Your files are notes in the margin of a story I've already finished. I am not here to be managed by you." She said it without heat, the way you state a geographic fact. "I am here because my husband is here, and because what comes next is going to determine whether this planet survives the next 10 years. If you want to be useful, stop thinking about what leverage you have over me, and start thinking about what Earth looks like when the war is already won. Because that is the problem I'm going to leave you with." Cecil looked at her. She could see him processing, the rapid, lateral thinking of a man who has had the floor pulled out from under him and is already calculating which ceiling to grab. "What do you want in return?" he asked. Because Cecil Stedman, stripped of every other option, always arrived at the transaction. She smiled, not warmly, the specific smile of someone who has been asked this question by a dozen heads of state across 9 centuries and knows exactly what it means when someone frames it this way. "Nothing you need to give me," she said. "The outcome is its own reward." She stood. She moved to the door. Cecil watched her go with the expression of a man who has just played his best hand and watched it accomplish nothing, and who is already, despite himself, beginning to respect the person who made that happen. The night before Conquest arrived was clear. They stood at the edge of the rooftop they had claimed, the same one, their rooftop now by habit, and looked at the horizon. The city below them was quieter than it had been, not recovered, not close to recovered, but quieter. The emergency lighting had expanded its reach by 2 sectors since yesterday. "Are you ready?" she asked. He said, "I stopped needing to be ready for things like Conquest somewhere around year 200. Then, because he knew what she was actually asking, because he had known what she was actually asking for 9 centuries, yes. For all of it." She looked at the horizon. "We'll do it cleaner this time. We'll do it faster," he said. "We'll do it together," she said. He looked at her in the specific dark of a city that was still learning to breathe again, and he said, in the private dialect, the phrase that was 900 years old and had never required revision. The thing that was true in the first year, and had remained true through every version of every impossible thing they had walked into side by side. She answered in the same dialect, same phrase. The precision of two people who found the exact words once, early, and kept them, because the exact words do not need to be replaced. Below them, the city worked on through the night. Above them, somewhere in the dark between here and the outer solar system, Conquest was on schedule. He was always on schedule. Conquest had not been surprised by anything in 400 years. This was not pride. It was not self-mythology. It was simply the accurate result of thousands of years of doing the same work against the same categories of opposition. The range of what the galaxy could present to a Viltrumite of his generation had long since been exhausted, and what remained was variation within known parameters. He had learned to read the variations the way experienced navigators read weather, not by being surprised, but by recognizing, earlier than anyone else in the room, which pattern was assembling. His briefing on the Earth assignment had been standard. Primitive world, post-conflict infrastructure damage, defensive capability significantly degraded. Primary subject, a half-blood designated Invincible, Nolan Grayson's son, manifested powers approximately 1 year ago, showing development metrics ahead of typical half-blood trajectory. The Argol bloodline rumors were noted in the briefing's appendix. Conquest had read them with the specific attention he gave to all political complications that were not his problem, which was the attention of a man filing something under irrelevant and moving on. His problem was the half-blood. His problem was the assessment and, if necessary, the example. He clocked the transit to Earth's solar system with the mild impatience of a professional arriving at a routine posting. He breached the atmosphere on a standard descent angle and ran his passive scan before committing to a landing site. The scan returned 2 Viltrumite bioelectric signatures on the planet's surface. Nolan Grayson's, which he recognized from millennia of operational proximity, and the half-bloods, which was stronger than the briefing had suggested and located in open ground 3 miles outside the primary population center. He also returned a third signature. Viltrumite, female, positioned beside the half-blood with a physical proximity that his scan read as deliberate. He checked her profile against his operational memory. Anissa, the deserter. Flagged in the pre-mission addendum as a complication of unknown category, she had left Viltrum without authorization 8 days ago, and her current location had been unconfirmed until now. She was standing next to the half-blood. Conquest processed this. He assigned it a category. Deserter aligning with primary subject, motivation unclear, tactical complication minor, and he descended to the cleared ground where they were waiting. Because, whatever this was, it ended on the ground, and Conquest had always preferred ending things on the ground. They had cleared the area. This was the first thing he registered when he landed, not the 2 figures standing in the center of the field, but the absence of everything else. The ground had been prepared. Debris moved to the perimeter. Personnel cleared from a radius that was larger than a defensive perimeter required, and exactly the right size for a high-speed engagement with room to maneuver. Someone had chosen this ground specifically, and had spent time on it before he arrived. He filed this. He did not yet assign it a category. Anissa was in Viltrumite officer's attire, not combat dress, something more formal, which made less tactical sense and more political sense, and the combination of those 2 things produced a data point that sat slightly outside his current model of the situation. She was standing at the half-blood's right side, not behind him, not at an angle that suggested deference or protection, exactly level. The geometry of it was the geometry of a formation, a paired combat configuration that had been run enough times to stop requiring conscious positioning. His millennia of operational experience filed this without his permission under. Something is wrong. He dismissed the filing. He was Conquest. A very long career of correct dismissals. He addressed the half-blood first, because the half-blood was the mission's primary subject, and Conquest had not survived this long by losing track of sequencing. He delivered the standard framework, empire, integration, requirements, final opportunity for compliance, in the specific register of contemptuous formality that he had developed somewhere around year 800 and had found reliably effective ever since. It established hierarchy without requiring physical demonstration. It gave the subject an out that preserved some dignity. Most subjects took the out. The half-blood did not respond. He looked at Conquest with an expression that Conquest had not encountered in several centuries. Not defiance. Defiance had a heat to it, the hot pride of a young fighter who believed that refusing the established hierarchy was itself a form of power. Not fear, which had its own vocabulary of forced stillness and over-controlled breathing. What Conquest was looking at was disinterest. Genuine, complete disinterest. The expression of someone who had heard this specific speech, not a version of it. This speech. Enough times that it had stopped registering as content and become mere noise. Conquest recalibrated. He shifted to Anissa, because the half-blood's response profile was outside his current parameters, and Anissa's situation was more straightforward. Desertion, he asked her, in the considerably less formal register he reserved for internal disciplinary matters, whether she had an explanation for her conduct. "You're standing in front of the Emperor of Viltrum," Anissa said. "The explanation doesn't get simpler than that." Conquest looked at her. Then at the half-blood. Then back. "That's an interesting way to describe a half-blood boy," he said. "The last person who described me that way," the half-blood said, "regretted it considerably. The tone of it was the problem. Conquest had been threatened before, explicitly, implicitly, by beings who carried significantly more physical credibility than a teenage half-blood. He knew the difference between someone performing a threat and someone stating a prior occurrence as relevant contextual information. What he had just heard was the second thing. The half-blood was not warning him. He was describing a historical event in someone else's experience as though Conquest might find it instructive. The filing system processed this and produced no satisfying category. Conquest attacked because conversation had a limit and he had reached it, and in a very long career nothing on the other side of that limit had required him to revise the approach. He went straight. Direct, maximum commitment, the full velocity of his initial charge aimed at the half-blood's chest, the standard opening that had ended engagements in the first 3 seconds for the better part of his operational career. The power of it was real. The speed of it was real. These were not performances. The half-blood was not where he had been. He had moved 6 feet to the left and slightly elevated, and the movement had the specific quality of something that was not a reaction. A reaction had a visible moment of registration, the body seeing the threat and responding to it, the fraction of a second of processing that even the fastest organisms produced. What the half-blood had done was something different. He had moved before the commitment was visible, which meant he had moved before the decision to commit was fully external, which meant he had read the decision in something prior to its expression. Conquest's charge passed through empty air. Anissa was already on his flank. He banked, the recovery was automatic, and caught her strike on his prosthetic arm. And the strike landed on the prosthetic deliberately. She had not aimed for his body. She had aimed for the arm. She had chosen the surface that would absorb the force without the yield she was looking for, and she had chosen it on purpose, which meant the purpose was not to damage him with the strike. She was positioning him. He processed where he was standing. He processed the specific angle of her strike and the vector it had created and the relationship between his current position and the half-blood's current position and where the half-blood was already moving. The half-blood was already in position. Conquest pushed off Anissa's strike momentum and created distance. The aggressive disengage of a fighter who has recognized a trap's perimeter and is removing himself from it. He needed space. He needed 10 feet of space and half a second to run the model correctly. He got 6 feet. The 10-second exchange ended with him 30 feet away from where he had landed. And for the first time since an engagement in the 4th century that he rarely thought about, Conquest was confused in the specific way of someone whose model of a situation has produced a result that the model cannot explain. He had engaged 2 opponents simultaneously before. He had won every such engagement, because 2 opponents who were coordinating in the reactive mode of most paired fighters, scrambling to cover each other, communicating mid-exchange, each one slightly behind the other's intent, were still 2 opponents operating sequentially. And sequential opponents had sequential vulnerabilities. What he had just encountered was not sequential. They had not coordinated. There had been no signal between them, no communication, no visible indication of who was doing what and when. Anissa had struck, and Mark had moved, and the result had been a geometry that put Conquest exactly where neither of them needed to be told to be, because they had both known where that was before the exchange began. He looked at them across 30 feet of cleared ground. The half-blood was standing in a position that covered Conquest's most efficient recovery vector without appearing to cover anything. Anissa was 3 feet from where she needed to be for the follow on his most likely disengage. Neither of them was in a posture that declared readiness. They were simply standing in the correct places, the way furniture is in the correct places, in a room that has been arranged by someone who knows how the room is used. Conquest's millennia of accumulated pattern recognition looked at this and produced, from very deep in the filing system, from the section that had not been accessed in several centuries because nothing had required accessing it, the concept of concern. He dismissed it. He was Conquest. He had been dismissing things for a very long time. But the dismissal, this time, took a fraction of a second longer than it should have. On the half-blood's ancient 17-year-old face, nothing changed. He was simply looking at Conquest the way Conquest had been looked at by very few things in a very long life. Not as an apex. Not as an overwhelming force that had already decided the outcome, but as a known quantity. A solvable problem. A step in a sequence that had already been run, in some prior configuration, enough times to have stopped being interesting. Conquest looked back. For the first time in 400 years, he was not entirely certain how the next 30 seconds resolved. There is a difference between a fight and an execution. Mark had explained this once to a junior military commander on a world whose name he no longer remembered, somewhere around year 400. A fight is when the outcome is uncertain. 2 variables entering a system, neither fully knowing the other, both adapting in real time to information they did not possess at the start. Fights were interesting. Fights required the specific aliveness of a mind that does not know what the next second holds. An execution is when you have already determined the outcome. The steps require precision and discipline and the particular kind of attention that belongs to craft rather than combat. But they do not require uncertainty, because uncertainty has already been resolved, in a room, before the first contact, by people with enough information to make the determination correctly. He and Anissa had been in that room. 900 years ago, in a different life, they had studied Conquest with the comprehensive attention of rulers who understood that the beings shaping the history of a civilization needed to be understood completely. They had reviewed every recorded engagement. They had identified every calcified pattern, every blind spot that a lifetime of never being forced to evolve had produced in a fighter who was extraordinary and entirely, fatally predictable. They had 31 seconds of steps to perform. They began. Anissa took the aggressor role first. This was the first deliberate decision of the sequence, made before Conquest landed, made in planning. Not in the moment, because decisions made in moments against opponents of Conquest generation were decisions made too late. She went at him with the quality of controlled recklessness, the specific presentation of someone spending themselves freely, attacking with full commitment, because she knew she could absorb whatever he returned. Conquest read this as overconfidence. He had been reading it as overconfidence for approximately 2 seconds when he understood he had misread it entirely. She was presenting targets. His dominant arm came across her guard and into her midsection. A real hit, calibrated at the force level that resolved most engagements immediately, the full weight of his refined capability landing without restraint. It hit. She absorbed it with 2 ribs giving on her right side, the specific crack of Viltrumite bone at this force threshold, the bright radiating pain of structural damage that she registered and catalogued and did not act on, because acting on it was not the plan. The plan was the 2 seconds his arm's follow-through created. His dominant arm, fully extended at the termination of that strike, had opened his left side for exactly 2 seconds before the recovery arc began. She had calculated this from the footage. She had measured it. 2 seconds was the window. She drove her counter not from her arms, but from her entire frame rotating into it, hips generating the force, shoulders transferring it, the full kinetic investment of a Viltrumite body committing its total mass to a single geometric point. It landed on Conquest's actual ribs, beneath the prosthetic arm's shadow, at the specific junction between his natural body and the prosthetic's attachment hardware, where the archived footage showed his defensive management was casual. A very long career of nothing ever reaching him there had made him casual. The impact sound was the sound of geology. Not a single crack, the multi-register sound of structural damage propagating, the particular acoustic signature of bone and connective tissue, and the attachment hardware all registering the same overwhelming input simultaneously. Conquest did not make a sound. He had taken damage before. He processed it and moved, because moving was what he did, because a very long career had produced in him a response to damage that was so automatic it operated below conscious thought, absorb, compensate, continue. Mark was not idle during this. He had been circling since the first contact. Not dramatically. The economy of someone performing a task he had rehearsed until it required no cognitive overhead, staying outside Conquest's primary engagement focus while maintaining the exact orbital distance that kept him in Conquest's peripheral awareness without triggering a target shift. Conquest had to know he was there. Conquest had to be making continuous partial attention decisions about whether to address him. Each of those partial decisions was attention not on Anissa, and each was an opening she used. While she was using them, he had been reading the prosthetic arm. The hairline stress fracture was in the internal structure, introduced by the opening exchange where Anissa's first strike had landed on the arm deliberately, not visible on the surface. Completely legible in the motion signature of a being he had studied for 900 years, the specific way the arm's tracking through Conquest's recovery arc had a fractional lag that wasn't there in the baseline footage. A hairline compromise in the internal load-bearing component. Invisible from outside. Entirely obvious if you knew what motion signature to read for. He knew exactly how much additional force, applied at exactly which angle, would resolve that hairline compromise into a catastrophic structural failure. Conquest tried to disengage from Anissa. Not fear, recalibration, the long career adaptive response to an engagement not producing expected outcomes, create distance, run the model again, identify the adjustment. He pushed her back and turned to create space. Mark closed the distance before the space existed. He did not attack with fury. He did not attack with the theatrical commitment of a fighter trying to prove something to an audience. He moved with the efficiency of a craftsman, performing a well-understood task. The specific quality of motion that belongs to someone who has done this. In some prior configuration, enough times that doing it has become the dominant mode, and thinking about doing it has become secondary. He found the stress fracture point with both hands. He applied force in the precise direction that maximized mechanical disadvantage, not straight, not at the obvious angle, but at 17 degrees off-axis from the arm's primary load-bearing orientation. The specific angle that the hairline fracture had made vulnerable, and that the arm's original design had never anticipated, because the arm's original design had never anticipated someone who had studied it for 900 years. The prosthetic failed. Not cleanly. Catastrophically, the internal components separating at angles the external housing could not contain. The failure propagating through the attachment hardware in the specific sequence that took the remaining biological connection with it. The arm came away from Conquest's body at the shoulder, and the separation was total and irreversible, and happened in approximately 1 second. Conquest made a sound. Not a scream, the involuntary vocalization of a body whose established parameters had just been exceeded for the first time in several centuries. The noise that escaped even the most controlled organism when the input was genuinely outside the range it had been built to process. Then he swung. His remaining arm, his real arm, everything left, maximum force, full commitment. The total output of a Viltrumite who had just lost something he had carried for most of his operational life and was responding by refusing, categorically, to accept the implication of it. It connected with Mark's jaw. The force of it was extraordinary in the specific way of something that carried centuries of refinement behind it, not raw power. Though the raw power was enormous, but the precise targeting and weight transfer of a fighter who knew exactly how to make a single arm strike land at its maximum effective force. Mark went back 30 feet in a horizontal line. He hit a piece of cleared debris at the field's perimeter, went through it, came to rest 6 feet beyond in a spray of fragmented material. 3 seconds. He got up on the second. Not all the way. To his knees first, then to his feet, the specific sequencing of a body taking stock of what the impact had cost before committing full weight to the next position. His jaw was wrong. Visibly, clearly displaced, the kind of structural disruption that ended engagements for beings considerably less durable than he was. While Conquest watched, Mark reached up with one hand and reset his own jaw. The motion was deliberate and routine, the specific quality of someone correcting a familiar problem. He looked back at Conquest across the field. "I've taken that hit before," he said. The words were slightly imprecise. The jaw was still in the first seconds of structural repair, but they were intelligible. This is the part where you realize it didn't work. Conquest was one arm, 2 ribs compromised and losing. The intellectual acknowledgement arrived before the emotional processing could begin, the discipline of a very long career, of running the model correctly regardless of what the model said, of accepting the result even when the result was this. He had one arm remaining. He had significant structural damage. His opponent was upright after a strike that should have ended him, and the woman to his left was already repositioning, and the geometry of the next 10 seconds did not resolve to an outcome that his established model had a category for. He attacked with everything remaining. Because he was Conquest and stopping was not something his operational architecture contained, and because the forward momentum of a very long career does not pause for the intellectual acknowledgement of an uncomfortable model. They converged. Anissa from his left, low, her strike taking his remaining arm at the elbow and driving it up and away from his body. Not hitting the arm. Locking it, removing it from the engagement with a leverage technique that used his own mass as the mechanism, her body weight and positioning doing the work that raw force would have done less efficiently. Mark from his right, above, already in the position that Anissa's movement had created, arriving into the opening with the timing of someone who had known the opening was coming before it existed. Together, in a technique that had no name between them because it had been executed too many times to require naming, force applied in exactly opposite directions at exactly the same moment. A compression that neither of them could have produced alone against a Viltrumite of Conquest's physical standing, but that together they had available, they completed the sequence. Conquest fell. The field was quiet. Wind moved through the cleared perimeter. 3 miles away, the city continued its recovery, indifferent to what had just happened in a prepared patch of ground at its edge. Mark and Anissa stood over him. Neither of them was breathing hard. Mark's jaw was still in the first stages of its repair, the bone resetting in the slow, continuous process of Viltrumite regeneration. An hour away from full function, Anissa's 2 ribs would be a 2-day problem. Both costs were real. Both were within the parameters of the plan. At the field's perimeter, a Gita observer looked at the timestamp on his recording equipment. He looked at it again. He said nothing to the person beside him. 31 seconds from first contact to Conquest's fall. 31 seconds. Cecil, watching the footage feed from the field command position, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, to no one specifically, we should never have been afraid of Conquest. His aide asked why. Because Conquest was never the real threat, Cecil said. He was just the messenger. In the field, Anissa looked at Conquest's body. Then she looked at Mark. In the private dialect, she said the words "for," faster than last time. Mark said the words "for," we had 30 seconds to spare. She said the words "for," we always do. The dark warmth of it, the specific humor of 2 people for whom this has become a reference point rather than an achievement, built entirely from the shared context of having done impossible things together until they became routine, lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then Mark said, "Get the comms array from his ship. We have a broadcast to make." She was already walking toward it. The technical work took 2 hours. Not because the equipment was unfamiliar. Anissa had operated Viltrumite military-grade communication arrays for the better part of 9 centuries, and the interface had not changed substantially because Viltrumite institutional culture considered consistency in critical systems a form of strength, which was one of the few institutional positions she had agreed with without reservation. She knew every function, every broadcast frequency, every encryption protocol, every harmonic identifier that would authenticate this transmission as originating from legitimate imperial hardware rather than a counterfeit source. The 2 hours were for the content, for the sequencing of arguments, for the precise targeting of each component against the specific constituencies within the Viltrumite population that needed to hear different things in a specific order for the political detonation to produce the correct result rather than a messy one. She had done political communication at this level before. She knew the difference between a message that fractured a power structure and a message that merely damaged it, and the difference was almost entirely architectural. Mark sat beside her through the preparation. Not idle, he was reviewing Imperial Archive data that she had reconstructed from memory, cross-referencing source documentation against the legal arguments she was building, flagging 2 citation sequences where the evidence chain needed tightening, and one where the framing was stronger than she had initially drafted it. They worked through it with the efficiency of people who had been editing each other's political communication for centuries. He made 3 corrections. She made 2 to his corrections. Neither of them discussed the process. The material was more important than the discussion. Outside, the field was quiet. The Gita had established a perimeter and was maintaining it with the professional thoroughness of an organization that had decided, in the absence of better options, to treat the situation as a controlled event. Cecil had not attempted to enter Conquest's ship. This was wisdom. When the content was final, Anissa looked at it once more from the beginning. Then she looked at Mark. "Primary?" she said. "You," he said. This was the deliberate choice they had discussed before the engagement. A Viltrumite woman declaring a false regent's illegitimacy carried specific cultural weight within the Empire's structure. Weight that a male heir making the same claim on his own behalf could not generate. It signaled that even those who had the most institutional reason to support Thragg's authority had abandoned it, which was a different argument from the heir simply asserting his right. And Mark would be visible throughout. His face, his bearing, the specific physical presence of a person carrying blood the galaxy was about to be told it should recognize. That was its own argument, and it required no words. She set the recording. She began. The broadcast opened with footage. Unedited, time-stamped by the GDA observer's equipment, source authenticated through the same observer's agency credentials. 31 seconds of a cleared field in Earth's eastern perimeter, beginning with Conquest's landing and ending with his fall. No narration. No framing. The footage made its own argument, which was the only kind of argument that could not be countered. It had happened. It had been witnessed. And the witness was documented. Then, Anissa spoke. Her voice was the voice she had used for 900 years, in rooms that required absolute precision. The formal register of someone who had stood before imperial councils and coalition delegations and species that had never heard Viltrumite speech before, and had needed, in all cases, to understand immediately that the person speaking was not to be misread. It carried no affect beyond certainty. Certainty, deployed correctly, was more authoritative than volume. She presented the Argall bloodline documentation, not as an assertion, as a finding. She named the specific archive locations where the suppressed files existed. She cited section numbers of Viltrumite foundational law that had not been publicly referenced in over 1,000 years because Thragg's administration of Viltrumite legal education had systematically redirected attention toward the Grand Regent's interpretive authority and away from the foundational code that the interpretive authority was supposed to serve. She provided the cross-referencing evidence connecting Nolan Grayson's lineage to Argall's direct descent, with the specific genetic documentation markers that any Imperial archivist could verify against the Empire's own records in under 4 minutes. Then she described what Thragg had done. Not in the language of accusation. Accusation implied a contested question, and there was no contested question here. She described it as a documented sequence of actions, the date the bloodline evidence had been discovered, the suppression order, the specific reclassification method by which the relevant archive material had been made inaccessible, the names of the 3 archivists who had processed the reclassification and their subsequent reassignments to positions with limited communication access. The dates of those reassignments mapped against the discovery timeline in a sequence that had only one interpretation. She said that Thragg had known the true heir existed. She said he had known it for decades. She said every military order against Earth had been issued not for the Empire's strategic benefit, but to eliminate a bloodline claimant before the claimant could become a political reality that Thragg's fraudulent authority could not survive contact with. Then, she addressed the Viltrumite people directly. Not the command structure, not the political apparatus. The pure-blooded Viltrumites, their numbers already reduced to something barely above counting, who were the last members of a species that had spent centuries understanding, in the specific way of people who lived with an unspoken fact daily, that they were nearly gone. She acknowledged this without softening it. Viltrumites did not respond to softening, and she had stopped attempting it approximately 800 years ago. She said, "You have been carrying the weight of a dying civilization under a leader whose authority was fabricated. You have been loyal to a structure built on a lie. That ends today. The heir is legitimate. The documentation is verifiable. The law is clear." She offered them what Thragg had never been able to offer and could not have offered regardless of how long he ruled. An emperor who was not simply the strongest Viltrumite alive, but the legal one. The end of the question that had existed, unspoken, in the background of every Viltrumite political arrangement since Thragg had assumed the regency. Whether the authority they were operating under had ever truly been earned, or whether it was simply what happened when the strongest being in the room decided that strength was sufficient justification. Then she stopped speaking. Mark said, "My name is Mark Grayson. I am the blood heir of Argall. I am coming home. Prepare yourselves." 43 seconds. He had counted them out during the preparation, long enough to establish presence, short enough to refuse to justify himself to an audience that the law did not require him to justify himself to. The silence after the 43 seconds was not empty. It was the silence of a statement that had already finished its work before it ended. On Viltrum, the broadcast reached its destination 6 minutes after transmission. Thragg received it in session. 14 Viltrumites in the throne room, senior military commanders, legal administrators, the small governing body that managed the Empire's daily operations under the Grand Regent's authority. They heard it together. When the 43 seconds of silence resolved into the end of the transmission, no one spoke. Thragg did not react. 1,000 years of rule had produced in him the absolute discipline of never showing, in a room with witnesses, anything that could be read as surprise or fear. He sat in the administrative chair that functioned as his throne, and he looked at the communication array, and his hands, visible on the armrests, were completely still. The Viltrumites in the room were not looking at the array. They were looking at each other. The specific triangulation of people taking stock of a situation that had just become significantly more complex. The older ones, those who had existed long enough to have studied foundational law before Thragg's educational reforms had redirected the curriculum, were exchanging a particular kind of look that Thragg noticed and could not prevent. Because the look was not rebellion and was not fear. It was recognition. They had just heard a legal argument they already knew was correct, and recognition was not the kind of thing you legislated against. He dismissed the session without comment. Across the galaxy, the broadcast found its audiences. Alan the alien received it through a coalition monitoring station and listened to it twice in full. When the second playthrough ended, he did not immediately reach for his communications equipment, because he needed 30 seconds to sit with the full implication of what he had just heard. Then he reached for it, because if Mark Grayson was declaring his intent to assume the Viltrumite throne, the coalition needed to be correctly positioned before the next 48 hours resolved, and 30 seconds was all he could responsibly spend on sitting with implications. On Earth, Nolan watched the broadcast on a GDA monitor in the temporary command facility. He watched it alone, which was a choice rather than a circumstance. When it ended, he did not move for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, to himself in Viltrumite, "You figured it out." He meant the bloodline. He meant the strategy. He meant something else that he did not have words for yet. Cecil watched the broadcast and immediately began drafting diplomatic communications to every contact the GDA maintained with any organization that had any relationship to any power structure that had just been implicated in what he had just watched. He drafted 8 in 40 minutes. He sent none of them. He stared at his screen. Then he drafted a 9th, addressed to a single recipient, containing 11 words, "Whatever you need from Earth to make this work." Name it. He sent that one. Aboard Conquest's repurposed ship, Mark looked at the communication array in the quiet after the transmission ended. "Thragg's going to fortify," he said. "Pull every loyal Viltrumite to Viltrum before we arrive." "Yes," Anissa said. "Good," he said. She looked at him. He said, "I want them in one room when we walk through the door. Every Viltrumite who needs to make a choice standing in the same space when we make it necessary to choose. A fractured response means years of cleanup across a dozen worlds. One room. One day. We settle it completely." She was quiet for a moment, running it. "Then, you've been planning this specific outcome since we woke up." "I've been planning this specific outcome for 900 years, he said. "So have I," she said. "Then we're ready." She turned back to the navigation console and began entering the coordinates for Viltrum, with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a very long time to enter a specific set of numbers and has finally been given the appropriate moment to do so. "Yes," she said. "We are." Nolan was in the northern sector when Mark found him. finishing the last of a structural clearance that had been blocking a primary evacuation route since the war. He set down the final section of collapsed facade, a piece of building that weighed approximately what a loaded freight car weighed, handled with the careful precision of someone who had learned that being useful in a broken city required restraint as much as strength, and straightened to find his son landing 10 feet away. Mark looked at him for a moment without speaking. Nolan had learned over the past 8 days to read these moments, the brief pause before Mark said something that mattered, the specific quality of attention he gave to the preparation of significant words. His son was 900 years old, and he still took his time with the things that were worth taking time with. Nolan found, unexpectedly, that he respected this. "We're leaving today," Mark said. "I know," Nolan said. "I've been watching the ship prep from the air." He paused. "I didn't ask. I know you didn't." Mark looked at the cleared street, at the work his father had been doing through the night, the systematic, patient clearing of a path so that people could move through what had been made impassable. "I want to tell you something before we go. Not everything, but enough." They walked, not toward anything specific, the specific nowhere of two people who need movement to have a conversation they cannot have standing still. The emergency lighting cast the street in amber, the color of every post-conflict city Mark had ever walked through on every world that had needed walking through. He told Nolan what he had decided to tell him. Not the reboot's mechanics, those were beside the point and raised more questions than they answered. The fact, in the timeline they had come from, Nolan's next several years had been bad. Not bad in the abstract. Bad in the specific, imprisonment, fighting. A sustained period of suffering that had not needed to happen, and that Mark had spent 900 years understanding had not needed to happen. Nolan walked beside him and listened without interrupting, which was a discipline Mark had watched his father develop over the past 8 days, and which he suspected was new. The Nolan of the original timeline had not been a man who listened without interrupting. This version was learning. "Why are you telling me this?" Nolan asked when Mark had said what he had come to say. "Because I need you to understand that what we're doing isn't only for Earth," Mark said. "It's for you too. And I need you to have that information before we leave, because when we come back, there will be a period where trusting us will require you to have already decided to trust us. I'd rather you make that decision with the full picture than have to reconstruct it afterward." Nolan was quiet for half a block. The city worked around them, a vehicle somewhere to the east, the structural complaint of a building 2 streets over that had not yet fully decided whether it was standing or falling. "Do you win?" he asked. Mark said, "We're going to." Nolan heard the difference between those two answers and filed it in the place where he filed things that were honest but incomplete. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Stay," Mark said. "Guard Earth. When we leave, you're the only Viltrumite-level asset the Gita has if something moves while we're gone. I need the planet defended by someone who can actually defend it, not managed by someone who's very good at managing things that can be managed." Nolan said, "Is that a compliment to Cecil or an insult?" "Both," Mark said, accurate either way. They had stopped walking. The street was empty around them, the amber light making everything look like the beginning or end of something. Nolan looked at his son, the teenage face, the ancient interior that he was only now developing the framework to see. "Are you asking me or telling me?" Nolan said. "Asking," Mark said. "I'd like to leave knowing you're here. The telling is available if the asking doesn't work, but I'd prefer not to use it." Nolan looked at him for a moment. Then, "I'll be here." Mark nodded. He started to turn. "Mark," Nolan said. He stopped. "I'm proud of you," Nolan said. He said it with the specific directness of a man who has learned, too late in most versions of his life, that the things worth saying are not improved by waiting. I've been proud of you for 8 days, and I don't fully understand what I'm proud of yet, but I am, and I wanted you to know before you left." Mark stood with this. 900 years of a complicated relationship with this man. The love and the grief of it. The long work of understanding that his father had always been doing his best with whatever tools the Empire and 2,000 years of Viltrumite conditioning had given him. And that doing your best with broken tools still produced wreckage, even when it also produced love. All of it was present. None of it settled on his face. "I know, Dad," he said. He turned and went, and Nolan watched him go, and the amber light held them both for a moment before Mark was in the air and gone. Cecil was at his field command post when Mark and Anissa came through the door together, which was the only way they came through any door. He was at his display, a cup of coffee beside him that he had forgotten was there, reviewing a diplomatic draft he had started 7 times and not finished. He looked up. "Timeline," he said. 72 hours from departure, Anissa said. "If we're successful, you'll have a new imperial structure to negotiate with. If we're not, you'll both be dead, and the Empire will send someone considerably less reasonable," Cecil said. "Correct," Anissa said. "We'll try not to be dead." Cecil looked at her, then at Mark. The specific expression he wore when he was doing math that he suspected was going to produce an answer he didn't like. "What does Earth do in those 72 hours? "Hold the line," Mark said. "The same thing Earth has been doing for 8 days. The same thing Earth has been doing its whole history." He looked at Cecil with the patience that had characterized every interaction between them. The patience of someone looking at a very long distance, at a man who was very good at his job and whose job was, in the current moment, genuinely insufficient for what was required. "You're very good at holding lines, Cecil. Hold this one," Cecil said, "and when you come back. When we come back, the political structure of the known galaxy will have changed," Mark said. "Earth's position within that structure will require negotiation. You'll be good at that part. And the negotiation will be with you. With the Viltrumite Empire," Mark said. "Which will be us." "Yes," Cecil looked at the display for a moment. Then he said, without looking up, "The 11 words I sent. Did you receive them?" "I received them," Mark said. "And?" "And we'll hold you to the offer if we need to," Mark said. "We probably won't need to." Cecil nodded. This was the closest thing to a farewell that Cecil Stedman was constitutionally capable of producing, and Mark recognized it as such. Anissa paused at the door. She looked back at Cecil, the specific look of someone making a final assessment and committing it to memory. "The thing you're drafting," she said. "The diplomatic communication. Stop starting it from Earth's position and start it from the position you'll be in when we return. You'll find it easier to finish." She left before he could respond. Cecil looked at the door, then at his display, then at the draft he had started 7 times. He deleted it and started again, from a different position. The ship launched from Earth at 1400 hours with 2 passengers and no announcement. Mark took the co-pilot seat. Anissa piloted, because Anissa had always been the better pilot, which was something he had acknowledged around year 80 after 3 decades of being wrong about it, and their operational division of responsibility had included this allocation ever since. The navigation calculation took 17 minutes. They had approximately 34 hours of transit after that. In the first hours, they did what they always did in transit. They debriefed, planned, ran the scenarios that the final stage of the operation required. The throne room configuration, the honor guard variables, the sequencing of the political argument against the physical one, the specific timing of the bloodline declaration that would make the ancient Viltrumites step back before anyone had to fight them. It was familiar work. They had done versions of it on 100 transits to 100 engagements across 9 centuries, and the familiarity of it was its own kind of comfort. The comfort of a routine that had survived everything that had tried to end it. Anissa slept for 8 hours. This was a discipline she had developed around year 150, when she had understood that rest before an engagement was not comfort, but performance optimization, and that she had no interest in performing below her capacity because she had been sentimental about sleep. She slept completely and woke clear. Mark did not sleep. He watched the star field through the forward viewport and let himself think the thought he always thought in the last hours before something significant. The one he had learned not to suppress, because suppressing it gave it more weight than confronting it. They could lose. Not easily. Not probably. But the variables were what they were. Thragg was 1,000 years of genuine apex capability, and the throne room specifics would not be fully knowable until they were in it. And unknown specifics in high-stakes engagements were the mechanism by which most plans met their limits. He had been in enough of those engagements to know the mechanism well. He sat with this. He made his peace with it, the way he made his peace with it every time, not by dismissing it, but by completing the calculation. The alternative to going was the continuation of everything they had come back to prevent, and the continuation was measurably worse than the risk of the going. The math was the same math it had always been. It still resolved the same way. He watched the star field. He waited for Viltrum. Anissa woke 2 hours from arrival and came to stand at his shoulder without a word. Which was not silence. It was the specific communication of someone who knows when the person beside them has been in their own head long enough and is offering, without making it a production, the simple fact of their presence as an alternative. Viltrum resolved on the navigation display as a coordinate, then as a point of light, then as a shape, blue-gray and angular in its atmosphere, the cold specific light of a civilization that had built everything it had around the principle that strength was the only honest currency. "We built it into something worth inheriting," Anissa said. "The first time. We'll build it better this time," he said. "Faster. I'll settle for not 800 years of wars," she said. 2 out of 3, he said. She took his hand. He held hers. Together they watched the shape become a world, and the world become a surface, and the surface become the specific geography of the place they had spent 900 years making theirs. It still was. The Viltrumite military tracking system picked up the incoming vessel with 9 minutes of warning. 9 minutes was enough time to scramble. Thragg had spent the past 36 hours ensuring it was enough time, consolidating his most loyal warriors to Viltrum's surface and orbital layer, pulling in the commanders whose commitment he was certain of and whose physical capability would make any confrontation expensive regardless of the legal situation. He had not done this because he was afraid. He had done this because 1,000 years of rule had produced in him the specific discipline of a man who never allowed his certainty to substitute for preparation. He issued the intercept order. 3 warships repositioned to the incoming trajectory. Anissa's broadcast on Viltrumite military frequencies arrived simultaneously with the intercept order, which meant the pilots received both at the same moment, the command from the Grand Regent to destroy the vessel, and the transmission from the vessel identifying itself as carrying the blood heir of Argol, and citing the specific sections of foundational law that made military action against it illegal aggression against the throne. 2 of the 3 commanders were old. Not old by human standards, old by Viltrumite standards, several centuries, old enough to have studied foundational law before Thragg's administrative reforms had restructured the curriculum, old enough to have the legal architecture of the Empire's original governance in genuine memory rather than suppressed archive. They received the intercept order and the transmission simultaneously, and they looked at the legal citation, and they looked at each other across the operational comms channel. The 3rd commander was younger. He moved to engage. The 2 older ones did not move to support him. The 3rd commander looked at his counterparts. He looked at the trajectory plot. He looked at the foundational law citations in the transmission, which his training had de-emphasized, but not eliminated. He looked at what being the Viltrumite who fired the first shot against the documented blood heir would mean for his standing, regardless of whether Thragg's authority survived the next 48 hours. He did not fire. The three warships held their positions. They did not clear the approach corridor. They did not fire. Anissa flew the ship between them without slowing, and continued to Viltrum's surface, because she had calculated that they would not fire, and the calculation had been correct, and hesitating would have communicated that she had considered the possibility that they might. They could have landed at the Imperial dock, used the formal entrance, sent a request for audience through the established administrative channels that the Empire maintained for exactly this kind of succession dispute, which was to say the channels that Thragg had spent decades ensuring would route everything through his office and resolve nothing without his approval. They chose not to. Anissa had the building's architectural records in memory, not this building specifically, but the throne room complex as it had existed across multiple renovations across multiple centuries, and her 900 years of governing from within this structure had produced the specific knowledge of how it had been built and where the building's design had prioritized aesthetic over structural integrity. The northeastern outer wall was the most recent addition. Composite material, the same grade as military spacecraft hulls, 4 meters of it. The internal bonding of composite material reached its maximum cured strength over the first 5 years after installation. The northeastern wall had been installed 3 years ago, 92% of maximum cured strength, 8% gap between what the wall was and what it would eventually become. She entered the trajectory into the navigation system with the focused precision of someone who had been planning this specific calculation since approximately day 1 of the transit. Mark confirmed the approach vector once, 30 seconds from contact, because confirmation was operational discipline rather than doubt. She confirmed. He confirmed. The ship hit the northeastern wall at the speed that produced a clean breach without destabilizing the primary structural supports, fast enough to overwhelm the composite's tensile resistance, controlled enough to preserve the ship's forward momentum through the breach for an additional 12 meters before hull contact with the interior. The wall came apart inward, not in pieces, in a cascade, the composite material's failure propagating through the internal structure in the sequence of something that had absorbed more force than its design had accounted for. The debris field moving into the throne room's interior in a dense wave of fragmented material and particulate that traveled the full width of the space before the momentum dropped below the threshold of continued movement, stone facing from the interior surface. Dust, the specific acoustic signature of a large enclosed space receiving a violent input, not an explosion, which was pressure expanding from a point, but an intrusion, which was force entering through a surface and continuing beyond it. The ship clipped the interior scaffolding above the throne room's entrance level and drove into the floor, the nose section compressing against the subflooring and plowing a trench 14 meters long before the remaining momentum resolved, and the ship came to rest with a finality that communicated the journey was over. Mark and Anissa were out before it stopped moving, not through the hatch, through a section of hull that the breach had compromised sufficiently to provide an exit faster than the hatch's hydraulic mechanism. They came through the damaged section and dropped to the throne room floor in the specific settling dust of the entry they had just created. 4 seconds from wall contact to standing in open space within the throne room. The dust was moving through the space in slow, heavy columns, caught in the cold blue-white light of Viltrum's afternoon that now entered through the breach in the northeastern wall. The interior was enormous, 12-meter ceilings, floor space designed to make everyone within it feel correctly sized relative to the authority that governed them. It currently held 14 Viltrumites in various configurations, 12 in the arranged positions of an honor guard, 2 in the seated positions of senior council members who had been in session when the approach trajectory became apparent on the building's internal alert system. And Thragg. He was at the far end of the room, standing in front of the administrative chair that functioned as his throne, and he was looking at them with the complete, comprehensive attention of a being that had ruled this room for 1,000 years and had received every category of challenger the galaxy had been able to produce and had processed all of them. He was processing them now. What his 1,000 years of pattern recognition was encountering was two people standing in the wreckage of the wall they had just driven a ship through, covered in the dust of it, wearing the specific expression of people who had arrived somewhere they had been intending to arrive for a very long time, and found it exactly as they had left it. Complete composure. Not performed. The real version, which was different in ways that 1,000 years of observing people perform composure had made Thragg capable of distinguishing. These two people were not controlling their fear. They did not have any to control. They were simply present, completely, in the way that only belonged to people who had already decided how this ended. This was new. In 1,000 years, this was genuinely new. Among the 14 Viltrumites in the room, the sorting happened in the first 30 seconds. 8 of the 12 honor guard held their positions. These were Thragg's people in the complete sense, trained within his institutional framework, promoted under his direct authority, with professional identities that were entirely products of his patronage. Whatever the bloodline law said in the abstract, their practical reality was the man standing 10 meters behind them. 4 of them stepped back, not behind Thragg, to the walls. Lateral movement, neutral ground, the specific physical declaration of people who had made a consequential decision in public and were communicating it through positioning rather than words. They were not declaring for Mark. They were declaring that they were not willing to stand between him and the law that the law itself said he represented. The 2 council members resolved differently. The older one moved to the wall immediately, without visible deliberation, with the unhurried directness of someone who had known this moment was coming since the broadcast, and had spent the intervening 36 hours deciding how to respond to it. The younger one stayed where he was, which told Mark everything he needed to know about that specific Viltrumite's relationship with the legal argument versus the political reality. Thragg watched all of this. He said nothing. He could not compel the ones who had moved without publicly acknowledging that he felt compelled to, which would itself be a concession he could not afford in front of witnesses. So he watched, and his hands on the armrests of the chair that was not quite a throne were completely still. Mark looked at the 8 remaining honor guard. He looked at them the way he had looked at 1,000 rooms over 900 years, taking the measure of what was in it, making the assessment, deciding what the moment required. "You have one opportunity to step aside," he said. "Take it!" 3 of them did. The movement was clean and without drama, Viltrumites deciding things and implementing them, no editorial. 3 of the 8 repositioned to the walls. 5 held. Mark looked at the 5. "Respectable," he said. Then, without looking at Anissa. She was already moving toward the 5 remaining honor guard with the purposeful stride of a woman who had been managing situations of exactly this category for 9 centuries, and had arrived, somewhere around year 300, at the understanding that the correct emotional register for them was professional interest, rather than personal engagement. They were a logistical element of the operation. She would address them the way she addressed all logistical elements, completely, efficiently, and without waste. Mark moved toward Thragg. The Grand Regent watched him come. 1,000 years of receiving challengers in this room had produced in him a specific posture for this moment. Weight settled, hands visible. The absolute stillness of a being that had never in its operational life felt the need to show readiness, because readiness was its permanent state. He was the most powerful Viltrumite alive. He had killed beings who believed they could change that fact. He was not afraid of a half-blood teenager regardless of what bloodline documentation the teenager's empress had broadcast to the galaxy. "You came here to die, boy," Thragg said. The word landed the way it had always landed in every version of this confrontation Mark had ever run in his memory, the specific diminishment of it. the reduction of the blood heir of Argol to a developmental category, deployed with the precision of a man who understood that language was its own form of force. Mark heard it with the flat recognition of something he had been expecting. "You used to call me that," he said. In a different version of this conversation, I let it bother me. Thragg processed this. The statement did not fit the profile of what teenage half-bloods said in throne rooms. It did not fit the profile of what anyone said in throne rooms. It referenced a prior conversation that had not occurred, from a position of familiarity with a dynamic that Thragg had experienced, and Mark theoretically had not. The processing took a fraction of a second longer than Thragg's processing usually took. Mark said, "Come on then." Thragg moved. Thragg did not posture. This was the first thing Mark had learned about him, in the records and the accounts, and eventually from the direct experience of governing in the same political space as the most dangerous Viltrumite alive. Lesser beings posture, they announce themselves, establish dominance through display, invest energy in the theater of threat before the substance of it. Thragg had not done this in 1,000 years because he had not needed to, and things that were not needed for 1,000 years stopped being available. He moved directly from decision to action, and the action was precise. And the precision was the product of 1,000 years of never once being forced to be anything other than exactly what he was. He went for Mark's chest. Not his head, not his throat, his chest. The specific targeting of someone who knew Viltrumite physiology well enough to know that compromising the ribcage's structural integrity removed an opponent's ability to generate force from the core, and who had identified this as the fastest path to a resolution that did not require extended engagement. Mark was not in his chest's previous location. He had moved, 3 feet right, 1 foot elevated, and the movement had the specific quality that had unsettled Conquest in the field, not a reaction, because a reaction had a visible moment of registration in the body before the response. This was something prior to reaction. He had moved before Thragg's decision was fully external, which meant he had read the decision in something that preceded its expression, the weight distribution, the micro-shift of Thragg's dominant shoulder, the specific geometry of his approach angle that had been present in the archived footage 17 times before this moment. Thragg's strike passed through air. The recovery was immediate. 1,000 years of never overcommitting had produced the adaptive response as automatically as breathing, the momentum redirected, the follow-through converted into a new position rather than a wasted motion. He was already reading Mark's new location and recalibrating. Mark's counter arrived at the neck, the nerve cluster beneath the jaw, the point he had identified from the footage as consistently impacted across multiple historic engagements, the place where accumulated strikes registered differently than impact strikes, because they were addressing a structure rather than a surface, not a finishing technique. A ledger entry. The first deposit in an account he intended to collect on. Thragg's head moved fractionally, the neurological system responding to the targeted disruption rather than the force behind it. He absorbed it and swung his left arm in a horizontal arc that Mark caught on his forearm rather than his body. The redirection eating the force, converting it into a controlled stagger that put Mark 2 steps back rather than 10 feet back. He came back. Across the throne room, Anissa was working. The 5 remaining honor guard had arranged themselves in the configuration that Viltrumite military doctrine specified for contained space multi-defender situations. Distributed spacing, overlapping coverage arcs, no clustering that would allow a single opponent to address multiple defenders simultaneously. It was correct doctrine. She had helped develop a revised version of it, approximately 400 years from now, during the Empire's 3rd military modernization program. She knew every gap in the current version. She went for the leftmost 2 first, because their positioning relative to each other created an interference corridor. The angle at which each could respond to a threat to the other required them to cross the same spatial line, which meant that forcing them both to respond simultaneously produced the specific outcome of them being briefly in each other's way. She forced them both to respond simultaneously. The entry vector was below and lateral, coming up through the angle their spacing had created rather than the direct approach that the doctrine trained them to anticipate. The first went down in the opening exchange, not from a single strike, but from the accumulated physics of 3 strikes delivered in the sequence that moved him from his position. Removed his balance, and then addressed the position he fell into, rather than the position he had started from. 900 years of combat refinement applied to opponents who were strong and trained and constitutionally unprepared for someone who had studied their doctrine from the inside. The second came from behind, while she was completing the 3rd strike of the first exchange. She heard it, the specific pressure change of a body at that velocity from that angle, and she dropped rather than turned, taking the strike across her shoulders instead of her neck. The difference between significant and catastrophic. She used the drop's momentum to continue into a roll that brought her beneath his guard and delivered the counter from the angle he had not protected because he had been assuming a standing opponent. He went down, 3 remaining. The doctrine adapted, reduced numbers producing tighter coverage, the spacing collapsing inward to compensate for the lost defenders. She read the adaptation while it was happening and identified the new gaps it created, because adapting a doctrine under pressure produced gaps in direct proportion to the speed of the adaptation. She found them. She used them. She was not unhurt. The shoulder strike had cost her something real, and one of the remaining 3 landed a blow to her left side in the 4th exchange that introduced a structural complaint she catalogued and continued through. The complaints were costs. The costs were within the parameters of the operation. By the time Mark needed her on his flank, all 5 were addressed. The fight between Mark and Thragg was different in quality from everything that had preceded it in this timeline. Conquest had been a demonstration, a solved problem being shown to have been solved. Thragg was something else, the actual ceiling of what the Viltrumite species had produced in 1,000 years of selecting for physical and tactical supremacy. Operating at that ceiling without decline, adapted to nothing, because nothing in 1,000 years had required adaptation. Mark was not stronger than Thragg. He was not faster than Thragg. He did not have 900 years of experience that simply overwhelmed 1,000 years of capability, because experience and capability were not the same currency and did not convert cleanly. What he had was information. Specific, comprehensive, 9-century-old information about a fighter who had not been forced to change in 1,000 years and therefore had not changed. The same 17 tells in the same 17 configurations. The same termination point on the left side follow-through that appeared in every archived engagement regardless of the opponent. The same casual management of the lower spine, a region where centuries of the identical fighting stance had introduced minute structural compressions that Thragg had never had reason to address, because nothing had ever reached them. Mark directed every strike at 3 points in rotation. The neck, the left shoulder, the lower spine. Not landing cleanly, Thragg's defensive management was too sophisticated for clean landing, but accumulating. Each strike that made contact, however partially, was a ledger entry. The ledger was building toward something. Thragg landed a significant hit at the 7-minute mark. It came from a variation Mark had not seen in the archived footage, not a new technique, but a familiar one deployed from an unfamiliar initiation angle. The specific adaptation of a 1,000-year fighter who had spent 7 minutes processing that his established patterns were being anticipated and had produced a modification. Mark had been waiting for the modification. He had not been able to predict its exact form, because predicting the exact form of a 1,000-year mind's adaptation was not something 900 years of study made possible. The hit caught him across the midsection. Real force, full commitment, landing clean because the angle was new enough that his guard was positioned for the previous angle. He went into the throne room's far wall. Stone and composite gave way, and he was through it and into the chamber beyond before the velocity resolved. He hit the chamber's far wall and used it deliberately, the impact absorbed, his feet finding the surface, pushing back. He came through the hole before Thragg reached it. Thragg stopped. He looked at Mark, the split lip, the ribs reporting their structural complaint, the body running its cost assessment in real time, with the expression of a being whose model of the engagement had just produced a result it did not fully account for. "You have skill," Thragg said, "more than your age accounts for. But skill ends where power begins." "Boy," Mark looked at him. He was breathing with the managed quality of someone whose rib cage was making the unmanaged version expensive. He said, "My name is Mark Grayson. I am 900 years old." Thragg was still. "And you have been terminating your left side follow-through at the same point in every recorded engagement for the past 8 centuries, Mark continued. "I counted 17 instances in the archived footage before I stopped counting, because the pattern was established. The stillness in Thragg was a different quality from the stillness before. 8 centuries of a documented fighting pattern was not the kind of self-knowledge any Viltrumite would willingly surrender to an opponent. The fact that Mark was citing it with specific detail, with a count, with the confidence of someone who had studied it rather than guessed at it, produced in Thragg's 1,000-year pattern recognition a response it had not produced in a very long time. "Uncertainty. You're not fighting a boy," Mark said. "You haven't been from the moment I walked through that wall." He attacked on the uncertainty. Not a power move. The left shoulder, precisely, the accumulated target of 7 minutes of ledger entries. Thragg's arm lost a degree of mobility that he compensated for immediately, because he was Thragg and compensation was automatic, but the compensation cost him the geometric positioning that had kept his lower spine protected, and Mark knew exactly what to do with the gap. He drove a strike into the lower spine. Specific, targeted the minute structural compressions that centuries of the same fighting stance had introduced, receiving direct force for the first time in 1,000 years. Thragg's movement changed. Fractionally, the specific quality of someone managing a new variable in real time. The management was fast and competent and could not fully restore what the strike had cost. Anissa arrived at his left, not running. Moving with the purposeful economy of someone executing a plan. The honor guard was handled. She was where the plan required her to be, which was here, now, at the moment the plan required it. She took her position. Thragg looked at her. At Mark, at the geometry of the room, 2 Viltrumite-class combatants at equal capability levels, one on each side, the configuration that his 1,000 years of singular dominance had not produced a category for, because nothing in those 1,000 years had ever produced the conditions. 2 on 1, he said. "You call this the rightful claim of an emperor?" The rightful emperor took on an entire army with his empress at his side for 900 years, Anissa said. 2 on 1 is a slow morning. Thragg attacked. Not with hesitation. There was no hesitation in him. The psychology did not permit it. He went for Mark because the bloodline was the political threat, and the political threat was the primary target. And 1,000 years of strategic discipline had never subordinated the correct sequence to the convenient one. Anissa was already moving. She drove into his left side from below, full mass committed at the angle that maximized displacement relative to force, not moving him significantly, moving him 4 inches, which at his velocity changed his termination point from Mark's chest to Mark's shoulder. 4 inches. The difference between the hit that ended the engagement and the hit that didn't. Mark took the shoulder hit with his guard already in position for it, because Anissa's displacement was exactly what they had planned for, and he turned the absorbed momentum into his counter, which came from the secondary angle that Thragg's committed attack had opened on his right side. The left shoulder. The accumulated point. Thragg's arm lost mobility that this time he could not fully compensate for, because the compensation had already been running at capacity, managing the lower spine variable, and capacity had a limit even at his level. Anissa drove into his right knee from the lateral angle. Maximum force. Precisely directed. The joint rather than the muscle. The structural target rather than the surrounding tissue, with the full committed mass of a Viltrumite frame that had spent 900 years learning exactly how to deliver force to exactly the place where it would resolve the specific problem in front of her. Thragg's knee gave. 1 degree. A single degree of structural yield. The joint's tolerance meeting the accumulated pressure of an engagement that had been specifically, patiently targeting it from multiple angles across multiple minutes. He arrested the fall before it became a collapse. Because he was Thragg, and the discipline of 1,000 years caught him before the physics fully claimed him. And he held the position on one knee in the dust of his own throne room floor. He looked up at them. He looked at the breach in the northeastern wall, at the throne behind him, at the ancient Viltrumites standing against the walls, watching, at the honor guard survivors, watching, at everything in the room that was watching the Grand Regent on one knee for the first time in 1,000 years. "You beat me with preparation," he said, not an accusation. The observation of a being completing an analysis, processing a result, accepting the result because his operational discipline had never permitted him to reject accurate results regardless of their content. Mark looked down at him. The ribs were still reporting. His shoulder would be a 2-day problem. He was breathing with the managed quality of someone whose body was running costs and finding them acceptable. "No," he said. He let it stand for a moment. "We beat you with something you've never had," he said. Thragg waited, because the discipline held even here. "Someone worth fighting for," Mark said. The throne room held its silence. The dust from the breach had largely settled. The cold blue-white light of Viltrum's afternoon came through the hole in the northeastern wall and laid itself across the floor in a long rectangle that reached almost to where Thragg knelt. Every Viltrumite in the room was watching. Mark did not make a speech. He did not perform authority. He stood in the wreckage of a wall he had driven a ship through, bloodied, ribs broken, healing already underway, and he was simply present, completely, without theater, and the presence was the argument, and the argument was sufficient, and the room knew it. That was enough. Mark and Anissa withdrew to a side chamber while the throne room processed what had just happened in it. This was the deliberate choice, not retreat, not uncertainty, but the specific political decision of people who understood that the most powerful thing they could do in the hour after Thragg's fall was give the Viltrumite people the space to arrive at their own conclusions without the air standing over them while they did it. Coerced acknowledgement and voluntary acknowledgement were not the same thing. And Mark had spent 900 years learning that the difference mattered enormously in the decades that followed a succession. He sat against the chamber wall and let his body begin its accounting. The ribs were the primary problem, 3 compromised, the structural complaint requiring managed breathing rather than full breath, which was an annoyance rather than a crisis, and would resolve over the next several hours as Viltrumite regeneration worked through the damage in its patient, continuous way. The shoulder was secondary. The split lip had already closed. Anissa's shoulder was worse than she had indicated during the engagement. He could see it in the specific way she held herself. The micro-adjustment of someone protecting a joint that was reporting more than she was going to acknowledge, unless he asked directly. "How bad?" he said. "Manageable," she said. "That's not what I asked. It's what I'm answering," she said. Then, because 900 years had produced in him the specific patience that outlasted her specific stubbornness, 2 days, maybe 3. The joint took the full force of that third honor guard hit and I didn't have the angle to redirect it. He nodded. 2 days was within the parameters of what came next. What came next did not require her shoulder to be functional. It required her to be present, which she was, completely, as she always had been. They sat in the quiet of the side chamber and waited for the math to resolve in the room beyond. It resolved over 4 hours. The bloodline law was not a matter of interpretation. The legal scholars confirmed this within the first hour, working from the archive documentation that Anissa's broadcast had forced into the open. The records were genuine. The genetic documentation markers were verifiable. The foundational law was unambiguous on the question of what verifiable documentation of a blood heir's existence meant for the legitimacy of a Grand Regent's authority. Thragg's loyalists attempted to argue that Mark's methods disqualified him. The ancient Viltrumites, the ones who had moved to the walls at the beginning, who had studied foundational law before the curriculum had been redirected, shut this down with the flat efficiency of people who had been waiting decades for an opportunity to apply the knowledge Thragg had spent decades making professionally irrelevant. The law did not specify methods. The law specified lineage, demonstration of capability, and formal acknowledgement. All 3 conditions had been met in the throne room. The argument was closed. One by one, the Viltrumite warriors made their choices. They did it without ceremony. Viltrumites did not make ceremony out of practical realities. They made assessments and acted on them. And the assessment here was that the legal structure of the civilization they had devoted their lives to serving had just produced a clear result. And serving the civilization meant accepting the result. They presented themselves to the intermediaries Mark had designated. They acknowledged. They waited. By the end of the 4th hour, the substantial majority of the remaining pure-blood Viltrumites had acknowledged Mark. The holdouts were Thragg's most ideologically committed loyalists, people whose identity was so thoroughly built around the Grand Regent's authority that the legal argument, however clear, could not immediately displace it. Mark offered them exile, not as leniency, but as logic. The Viltrumite population was devastatingly small. Reducing it further was not something he was willing to do for the sake of a resolution that could be achieved without reduction. They were too valuable to the species' demographic survival to spend on a political argument that was already legally settled. Most of the holdouts took the exile. They would need time. Mark had calculated that most of them would find their way back within a decade, when the shape of the new structure became legible and the alternative, deep space without community or purpose, became what it actually was rather than what pride made it appear to be. A handful refused. They chose to fight rather than accept. Because some identities could not survive the thing they had been built around being proven false, and fighting was the only response those identities had available. Anissa handled them, alone, while Mark completed the succession documentation with the legal scholars. The fights were not described. They were not the story's climax. They were administrative, the final line items of a transition that had already resolved, addressed with the professional efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 900 years and had long since stopped finding it anything other than necessary and sad. The message to Earth went out before the formal ceremony. Mark composed it himself, in the specific factual register of someone who understood that Cecil Stedman responded to information and not to theater. Mission complete. Thragg is dead. Viltrumite succession resolved under bloodline law. Earth is under imperial protection as of this transmission. All pending occupation and integration programs against Earth are cancelled with immediate effect. No further military action against Earth will be authorized under this administration or any administration that follows from it. We will return within 48 hours. Cecil's response arrived 11 minutes later. 11 minutes was long for Cecil, which meant he had spent 11 minutes looking at the message before sending back the 7 words that represented the full extent of Cecil Stedman's capacity for something resembling warmth. Understood. We'll talk terms when you're back. Mark read this and smiled, the private version, the one that belonged to the specific recognition of a person who had not changed in 900 years and was not going to start now, and who was, in his complete predictability, one of the most reliable things Mark had ever encountered. Nolan's response took longer. It arrived 40 minutes after the initial transmission, which meant he had spent 40 minutes with the information before finding the words, which meant the words had mattered to him enough to wait for the right ones. 4 words. In Viltrumite. I always believed you. Mark held the communication device for a moment. He thought about his father in the amber light of the cleared street, saying I'm proud of you before he fully knew what he was proud of. He thought about a man doing his best with the tools he had been given, across 2,000 years of having been given the wrong tools, and finally being given the right ones. He set the device down. He went to find Anissa. They were alone in the throne room before the ceremony. The bodies had been cleared. The breach in the northeastern wall had emergency composite patches on it, functional, if not aesthetically consistent with the original material. The floor trench from the ship's landing had been temporarily covered. The room was functional, if damaged, which was the accurate description of most things that had just survived something significant. The throne of Viltrum was in front of them. It was not a beautiful object. Viltrumites did not build for beauty, they built for function and authority, and this object had been built to communicate both, and it communicated them in the specific way of something that had been used for its intended purpose for long enough to carry the weight of that use in its material. 1,000 years of Thragg. Centuries of the Empire in its pre-Thragg configurations. Older than that, in the foundational wood of it, the distant half-mythological memory of Argal himself, who had sat here first and whose bloodline had just returned to claim it 800 years after it was supposed to. Anissa looked at it. She said, "The first time, it took us 300 years to reach this room." "I remember," he said. 300 years of wars. Occupation campaigns, political negotiations that kept collapsing, alliances that kept failing. She looked at the throne, and the weight of those 300 years was in her voice. Not grief, not bitterness, but the specific gravity of someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time, and is standing in the place where they were always going to set it down. "We're here in 8 days. We were slower the first time," he said. "We didn't know the way." She turned to look at him. He was battered, the last of the injuries still working through their resolution, his face carrying the specific marks of an engagement that had cost something real. And for one unguarded moment he looked exactly like what he was, a teenager carrying 900 years, young face and ancient interior, standing in the room that had always been his by law and had finally been made his by fact. She took his face in her hands. Not gently. Gentleness was a choice she made rather than a default, and she made it now, deliberately, because this moment was worth the deliberateness. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across 9 centuries of shared life, completely, without reservation, the full specific attention of someone who had chosen this person relentlessly for 900 years and would choose him again without hesitation. 800 years of wars we haven't had to fight, she said. 800 years of planets we haven't had to subjugate. 800 years of people who haven't had to die for us to reach this room. "I know," he said. "Was it worth it?" she said. "Coming back. All of it." He held her gaze. He thought about Earth, still broken but no longer threatened. About Nolan, who would not spend years in chains in the version of events that was now the only version. About the deaths that would not happen, the suffering that would not occur, the 800 years of history that did not need to be written in blood because they had come back with the knowledge to skip it. He thought about 30 years of the alternative, 30 years of this, of administration and argument, and the slow, unglamorous work of building something worth inheriting. About Anissa reviewing transition documents across a table from him, finding them tedious, arguing with him about it, being wrong about it, and knowing she was wrong and arguing anyway. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She stepped back. She looked at the throne. "Shall we?" she said. He took her hand. They walked to it together. The ceremony was Viltrumite. Brief, binding, and entirely without the performative elements that human cultures attach to moments of succession. Because Viltrumites had never developed the concept that the significance of a moment was improved by elaborate ritual around it. The significance was in the fact. The ritual was what you did when the fact needed help. The fact needed no help. The Viltrumite elders present recited the bloodline acknowledgement, the ancient legal language that had not been spoken in the Empire for over 1,000 years, since Argal himself had heard it applied to his own succession. It was not a prayer, it was not a speech, it was a legal declaration. The heir has proven lineage, demonstrated capability, and assumed the throne by right of blood and right of combat under the foundational law of the Viltrumite civilization. The Empire is his. Mark and Anissa occupied the throne together. There was one throne. There had always been one throne. They occupied it the way they occupied everything. As a unit, completely, the geometry of two people who had spent 900 years being each other's most fundamental constant, and had stopped being able to locate the boundary between where one ended and the other began. The assembled Viltrumites stood. They did not cheer. Viltrumites did not cheer. They stood, and their standing was the acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement was sufficient, and the room that had held Thragg's authority for 1,000 years held something else now. Something that had arrived through a wall and a broadcast and a 31-second execution and a fight that 900 years had made possible, and that was now, simply, real. The recording is time-stamped approximately 30 years after the succession. The voice is Mark's, older in affect than any 17-year-old has a right to sound, though by this point the affect and the body have had 3 decades to begin reconciling. People always ask what we changed, what the difference was, coming back with 900 years of knowledge instead of arriving at things as they came. The answer is simpler than they expect. We didn't fight the wars. That's all. 900 years of wars that had to happen the first time, because every path to this room was cut off by circumstances we didn't understand yet. Every political solution was locked behind violence. Every alliance required decades of negotiation under the constant threat that the negotiation would collapse and the violence would resume. We walked in and skipped all of it. 8 days. 2 fights. 1 broadcast. We went from the beginning directly to the end, and everything between, the 800 years of everything between, didn't happen. Those years are somewhere that is not this timeline, and the people who would have died in them are alive in this one, and the worlds that would have been subjugated in them are not, and that is what 900 years of living them first cost and what coming back with them purchased. Is that worth it? Is 900 years of living something worth the chance to skip it? I don't have a universal answer. Philosophers have been working on it for 30 years and will be working on it 30 years from now. The calculus involves variables I'm not qualified to resolve. What I know is this. Anissa is across from me while I record this. She is reviewing the transition administration documentation for this quarter's report, which she finds tedious and I find genuinely interesting, and we have been having the same argument about this division of labor for 27 years. She is wrong about it. She knows she is wrong about it. She argues anyway because she has always argued positions she knows are losing when the positions are worth arguing. Which is one of the things I have loved about her for 930 years. 800 years of wars. And instead, we got this. 30 years of this. With more ahead. I would make the same choice every time. Every single time. In the throne room, through the window that looks out on Viltrum's star field, the stars are unchanged. They were there before Argal. They were there through Thragg. They are indifferent to the 2 figures on the single throne, reviewing documents and arguing about filing systems in a private dialect that did not exist 30 years ago and will outlast everything else in this room. The galaxy shifted. The stars did not notice. The stars do not need to. The story is complete. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.